The number that stopped me wasn't the death toll, it was the count of separate fires, 17 distinct ignition sites across Illinois, Wisconsin and Michigan, all on the night of October 8th, 1871. Not one fire that travelled, not one source that spread. 17. The Great Chicago Fire destroyed 2,100 acres, and you learned about it in school. 200 miles north, the Peshtigo Fire killed up to 2,500 people in a single night and burned 1.2 million acres, and most people have never heard its name. That disproportion alone should bother you. The 17 ignitions are what keep me up. The official story is fair, and I want to give it its full hearing before I complicate it. The autumn of 1871 had been exceptionally dry across the Great Lakes region. Rainfall deficits from July onward had left timber, harvested crops, and uncleared brush in a condition that contemporary observers compared, in more than one newspaper account, to kindling waiting for a spark. Logging crews, railroad workers, and farmers had been burning debris throughout the season, standard land clearing practice for the era, and smouldering piles were common at the edges of fields and along rail corridors across Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. On the night of October 8th, a strong southwest wind moved through the region. The conditions were, by any reasonable measure, dangerous. The Great Chicago Fire is the version of this story that survived. It consumed approximately 2,100 acres within the city limits, destroyed an estimated 17,400 structures, and displaced roughly 90,000 people in a city of 300,000. The financial loss was calculated at approximately $200 million, close to a third of Chicago's total assessed property value. The Tribune covered it. The wire services carried it. Mrs. O'Leary's barn became national folklore. Chicago rebuilt, and the fire became a story of catastrophe followed by civic reinvention, which is the kind of story that gets preserved. What did not get preserved, not in the curriculum, not in the cultural record, not in most American classrooms, is what was happening 200 miles north in Wisconsin at the same hour. The Peshtigo Fire ignited on the evening of October 8th, 1871. Same night, same explanation. It consumed approximately 1.2 million acres across northeastern Wisconsin and into the upper peninsula of Michigan, and it killed somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 people. The range exists because the records that would close it do not survive. The town of Peshtigo itself, a lumber and woodenware manufacturing community of approximately 2,000 residents, was, according to survivor accounts, gone within an hour. Witnesses described a wall of fire moving faster than horses could run. Bodies were recovered from the Peshtigo River, where families had waded in to escape and did not come out. The Peshtigo Fire killed more people in a single night than the Great Chicago Fire. It burned more acreage than any wildfire in recorded American history before or since. And it is not in the standard curriculum. I don't dispute the drought. I don't dispute the wind. I don't dispute that fires started that night for reasons that were individually explicable. What I dispute is the footprint. Holland. Michigan burned on October 8th, 1871. Manistee, Michigan burned that night. Port Huron, Michigan burned that night. Researchers examining the documented fire record have identified between 17 and 24 distinct fire areas across 3 states, all igniting within approximately the same window of hours. Some were small, some consumed entire towns. What none of them shared was a continuous overland fuel corridor connecting them all to a single point of origin. The sites on the eastern and western shores of Green Bay, Wisconsin, were separated by a body of water approximately 118 miles long and between 10 and 20 miles wide. Fire does not cross Green Bay. The Michigan sites sat on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, separated from the Wisconsin fires by the lake itself. Port Huron was 350 miles from Peshtigo by road at the base of Lake Huron. The official explanation, wind-driven debris igniting drought-stressed tinder, accounts plausibly for fires sharing a common fuel corridor. It accounts with considerably more difficulty for 17 separate ignitions in locations divided by the Great Lakes. This is the problem that the record assembled around Chicago and then quietly extended to cover everything else. Each fire was reported in isolation by the local paper that survived to report it as a local disaster with a local explanation. No single account in 1871 mapped all 17 sites together and asked what the composite picture required. Not then, and not in the 150 years since. The pattern presents itself anyway. 17 sites, 1 night, 3 states, fires on both sides of bodies of water that fire cannot cross. A composite picture that the official record has never assembled, because assembling it produces a question that drought and wind do not answer. I want to be precise about what I am and am not saying. I am not claiming the fires were set deliberately. I am not in a position to claim that, and I won't. What I am saying is that the explanation the historical record settled on was built to account for Chicago, and was then extended without proportional scrutiny to account for everything else that burned on the same night across 3 states. The question the official record does not answer is not why Chicago burned. The question is why 17 places burned. Consider what fire behaviour requires for simultaneous ignition. A fire driven by high wind travels along a continuous fuel corridor. Dry grass, cut timber, uncleared brush, advancing in the direction of least resistance. This is how fire moves. It is not how fire appears on both sides of open water at the same hour. The Green Bay problem is not abstract. The fire sites documented on the western shore of Green Bay and those on the eastern shore were separated by between 10 and 20 miles of open water. Elias Howe, a surveyor working in Marinette County in November 1871, wrote in his field notes that the destruction on the bay's western edge showed no connection whatever to the fires burning opposite. Fire scientists examining the 1871 record have noted the same discontinuity. The fires did not travel to the eastern shore, they originated there. The same pattern holds in Michigan. Holland and Manistee sit on Lake Michigan's eastern shoreline, separated from the Wisconsin fires by the lake itself. Port Huron sits 350 miles from Peshtigo by road, at the base of Lake Huron. What I dispute is not that those places burned. What I dispute is the mechanism that burned them simultaneously. What I dispute is the silence that settled over the question once Chicago had been explained. Now consider what fire destroyed beyond the buildings. The Peshtigo Eagle, the regional newspaper of Marinette and Oconto counties, burned. The township clerk's office burned. Catholic church registries for the town's heavily immigrant population, many of them recent arrivals from Germany, Norway and Belgium, burned. Lutheran congregational records in Brown and Kewaunee counties burned. Probate records, property deeds, and naturalization papers filed in Oconto County burned. Father Peter Pernin, the Catholic priest who survived by wading into the Peshtigo River, wrote in his 1874 account that when he returned to the site, not a written record remained to tell who had lived and died. The death toll has never been definitively established, because the records that would establish it do not exist. Holland followed the same pattern. The Dutch Reformed immigrant community that had built Holland, Michigan since the 1840s lost the first Reformed church, Hope College's main building, and its municipal records in a single night. Manistee lost its courthouse along with Manistee County's deed books, birth registers, and tax rolls. In each location, what burned was not only the built environment, what burned was the record of who had been there. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. The demographic profile of these communities matters. The Great Lakes Fire Corridor in 1871 was one of the most heavily immigrant-populated regions in the entire country. German, Norwegian, Swedish, Finnish and Dutch settlers had been establishing communities across Wisconsin and Michigan since the 1840s, and many were minimally documented at the federal level. The records that anchored their lives to verifiable identities, birth certificates, marriage registers, property claims, naturalization petitions, were held locally in the churches and courthouse offices that the fires consumed. What remained in the federal record after October 8th was a name in a census ledger, with nothing beneath it to confirm the life that name had belonged to. The 1870 census had captured these populations 1 year earlier. It gave them names, household structures, and county addresses. What it could not do, what no federal record alone could do, was replace the civil infrastructure that made those names traceable. When the local registries burned, the thread connecting those people to verifiable histories was cut at the root. Without the parish registers, the probate books, the deed filings, a name in a federal ledger becomes a marker without a territory beneath it. Within a decade, the orphan train placements peaked. The years 1882 to 1892 saw the highest annual placement rates of the entire program, and the primary receiving states, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, Iowa, were precisely those whose documentation infrastructure had been most disrupted by the 1871 fires. Children with no recorded origins arrived in communities that had themselves recently lost the capacity to verify origins. The absence of records on both ends produced, according to researchers who have examined placement registers, almost no institutional alarm. Gaps were normal. The fires had made gaps the expected condition. What I am saying is this. A documentation void was opened on October 8, 1871, across the exact geographic corridor that would absorb the largest share of orphan train placements over the following decade. Whether that void was accidental in its origins is the question the record has never answered. The consequences were not accidental. The origin of the void is the question nobody has assembled the complete record to answer, because the complete record does not exist. What burns in a fire? Buildings, records, names. Into the silence where names had been, children arrived carrying none. There are towns that appear in the 1870 federal census and do not appear in any subsequent record with the same population, the same name, or the same institutional continuity. Sugarbush, Wisconsin, a settlement of approximately 400 people in Oconto County, had no surviving residents capable of filing a damage report. It had no surviving records at all. What the 1870 census captured as a functioning community was, by November 1871, a geographic coordinate with no documentation of the lives that had occupied it. Orphan train rider John H. Brady, interviewed in 1910 by the Children's Aid Society, stated that his own background had been described to him only as from the Lake Country, no family known. He was placed in Indiana in 1884. His origin state in the placement register reads Illinois. His origin county, blank. Researchers attempting to trace his family line have found no civil record in any Great Lakes county predating his placement. The thread begins at the train platform and goes nowhere before it. What I dispute is not his story. What I dispute is how many stories terminate at the same point. What I dispute is the institutional architecture that built those endings into the record by design. The 1890 census was the document built to close all of this. For the first time, each household received its own dedicated schedule. It recorded immigration status, naturalization progress, household composition, and the relationship of every individual to the head of household across 63 million people at the exact peak of orphan train placements. It would have shown whether the post-fire communities of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Illinois held continuous populations or replacement populations. It would have shown whether children living with farming families in the Midwest in 1890 carried verifiable origins or gaps where origins should have been. It was destroyed. January 10th, 1921. A fire in the basement of the Commerce Department building. The Census Bureau estimated that restoration would require 2 to 3 years. They never started. The surviving schedules sat in warehouse storage for 12 years, untouched and deteriorating. In December 1932, a clerk quietly added them to a routine list of papers approved for destruction. Congress authorized it on February 23, 1933. The following day, they laid the cornerstone for the new National Archives building. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Now consider what the 17 fire sites shared. They sat along active or projected railroad expansion corridors. They were populated predominantly by immigrant communities carrying minimal federal documentation. They occupied land actively contested for industrial and agricultural consolidation under ownership frameworks that required prior claims to be absent, unclear, or legally unprovable. They burned during the single decade when that consolidation was accelerating fastest. Each element, considered alone, has an explanation. Assembled together, they describe a structural condition that drought and wind do not account for. I spent weeks trying to find a single document mapping the 1871 fire footprint against orphan train intake origins with enough geographic specificity to close the question. It does not exist. The organizations that ran the trains did not record origins with sufficient precision to permit the analysis. What I dispute is not the absence of that document. What I dispute is that no body of authority has ever demanded its reconstruction. What I dispute is that the Children's Aid Society, the New York Foundling Hospital, and the American Female Guardian Society still hold restricted archives more than 150 years after the first train left New York, and still describe their disclosure policy as providing only non-identifying information in the form of a letter. 250,000 children. 17 simultaneous fires across 3 states. A census destroyed before anyone read what it said about where those children lived and with whom. Sealed archives that no independent body has ever audited. A historical record that has treated each element in isolation. The fires explained by drought, the children by poverty, the census by negligence, without ever assembling the composite picture that their timing, geography and institutional management together demand. Maybe all of it is coincidence. I have spent enough time in this material to know what coincidence looks like. I know what a pattern looks like too. The towns exist, some of them, rebuilt under new names with new populations and no continuous civil record connecting them to what stood before October 8th, 1871. The archives remain closed. The 2 to 3 million Americans descended from orphan train riders still carry gaps in their family trees at precisely the coordinates where the fires burned and the records ended. The children who rode those trains were real. The towns that burned were real. The records that no longer exist were real once. And the people who should be in those records, whose names appear in one census and nowhere after, deserve an accounting that the institutions responsible have never provided and do not appear to intend. The fires went out a long time ago. The questions they left have not.